Welcome back to African Black Psychology as we continue our discussions on the Maafa, the African Holocaust in the Americas. In this session, we'll talk about resistance movements and how African people resisted enslavement. Previously, we discussed how African people were controlled and tools or techniques were used to prevent African people from resisting enslavement. Oftentimes, enslavers, European slave owners, would exist in constant fear of rebellion and vengeance. African resistance too was persistent. Resistance to enslavement was persistent, unwavering, multifaceted, highly tactical, and sophisticated. We'll discuss a couple ways African people resisted enslavement: by burning barns, fields, and poisoning food, water, faking illness, inducing illness, and acting ignorant, dumb, or stupid. African people resisted in the brutality of everyday life on the plantation, and again, the resistance was highly tactical, very strategic in terms of how the African people worked to strategize against ways to avoid the raw brutality that existed during the enslavement time period. Additionally, some enslaved Africans would spy on whites and act as informants, communicating between plantations. And the fact that African people put an effort to resist enslavement means that it actually rebuts the myth that African people just acquiesced to enslavement and just accepted it like, oh no, that's cool, we're happy to be enslaved. African people actually resisted enslavement and fought against it. There were evidence of over 250 slave revolts and conspiracies. In addition, there were also individual acts of rebellion as well as collective group acts of rebellion. Individuals would oftentimes, based on the raw brutality that the African experience, would assassinate the overseers, the paddy rollers, the slave owners, and would even commit suicide en masse or individually as an act of resistance. Other resistance included the various different rebellions that occurred throughout history. Some of the more famous known are the Mingo Rebellion, Cato, Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey, and Nat Turner rebellions. After each of the major rebellions, laws began to change to impact how enslaved Africans were treated, be it rules of carrying identification, reading, and what violence would happen if an enslaved African rebelled. Be clear, however, that enslaved Africans did rebel and fight against the enslavement, which is not often taught in the school books. Between 1830 and 1860, 2,000 enslaved Africans, over 2,000 escaped to the land of the free. Oftentimes, these free lands were dense swamps, forests, and mountainous regions in the Americas. Again, protective environments where it would be challenging or difficult to traverse the land to get to the location of solitude. So at times, African people joined with indigenous people, Native American Indians. And we know that African people have a lot of Native American or Indian, First Nations blood in their family. So it's just some examples of where African people escaped to, including the swamps and dense forests. And the need or desire to escape was definitely connected to the idea that African people were being brutally assaulted, hurt, killed, ripped apart on a horse or gibbeted apart. So a lot of beheaded, a lot of raw violence. A lot of the raw violence that African people experienced caused them to want to resist enslavement. So escaping was not an easy task. And again, the effort to escape was highly tactical. And some great examples of escape and Maroon life include the Saint-Domingue slave revolt or the Haitian Revolution. And the reason why the Haitian Revolution, which lasted from 1791 to 1804, was so significant is because it was a complete overthrow of the system of enslavement in Saint-Domingue. And so that meant it also was significant because it influenced other slave insurrections. In its influence, African people heard that people in Haiti got free, so we can get free as well. That means it established the first independent Black republic. Jean-Jacques Dessalines was responsible for the completion of the revolution, but it is also owed to people like Cecile Fatima Makandal and so on. So African people were being worked to death, literally worked to death in Haiti and Haiti, or Saint-Domingue, because they died at a much earlier rate than those who were African people on other plantations. So because they were already dying, the Haitian people said or fought liberté or la mort. They fought and argued liberty or death because they were already dying. So this was fear, it provoked fear in the enslavers because it was a representation of victory. It was an example of victory where African people got comprehensively free. And so much so wrote as a part of their institution that Black people could not own land. So this tremendous upheaval of African vengeance was the get back. What do they young people say? Getting the lick back, whatever it's called. Because the African people were dying in mass number, being worked to death, making money for the enslavers and struggling. So the idea of getting free was significant, very important, and this was the most important, I would argue, the most important revolution in modern African history. And again, the Haitian Revolution inspired others, but African people would, separate from Haiti, the free land, African people would escape to the hills in places like Jamaica. The Maroons of Jamaica also fought to get and to remain free. We have Nanny, who was supposed to be one of the queen of Nanny Town. Nanny was responsible for taking good care of African people and making sure that there was a place for African people to be free. The Colombos were also Maroons of Brazil in a famous place called Palmares. There's a film called, it's over there, Quilombo, that depicts all the challenges that happened in Palmares, but primarily all of the victories. And the human condition of enslavement was violent under Eurocentric enslavement. It was violent, aggressive. Women were raped, all of those things. So the normative condition for African people is not as a slave. The normative condition for African people is freedom. For all people should be freedom unless you have committed some form of criminal act. When we said earlier on in the lecture series that African people who were enslaved were treated almost as if they had committed several very heinous crimes. So to be free in a land just simply meant that African people were living as human beings. And the Colombos of Palmares was another example of that. Was that all my Quilombos? Jamaica? Okay. I'd encourage you to research. Oh, that might be extra credit. Other locations. So what does this mean for African Black psychology? The Maafa for African Black psychology. First, we have to understand that the system of enslavement sought to break the very will of Africans to exist as humans. Through raw violence, brutality, ripping of the Africans from their family, home, and complete and total erasure of cultural identity, African people were broken. Well, that was the goal. So the psychological tenacity through the trauma, through the courageous resistance should be acknowledged. And psychologically, African people represented character and fortitude, despite all of the aggression, violence, and things like that. So the meaning for the Maafa is that it is significant. The Maafa signifies, the African Holocaust signifies the psychological manner in which the masses of African people entered into the American context. So I would argue, if you are of African descent, that we are here in the Americas as a result of this trauma, the Maafa, and it has a psychological impact on the mind of the African. Additionally, this process of the Maafa disconnected African people from their African cultural reality. We oftentimes don't realize how far removed we are from African culture and tradition, from our African cultural identity, knowing who we are, which also results in psychological trauma, mental health issues with the question of color and identity. So that also then supports the psychohistorical trauma of this horrific experience, created not only a mental emotional void, a physical void between the United States and the continent of Africa, but it left behind a profound distortion in the psychological existence and identity of African people. African people struggle with who they are / we are. Some African people, if their hair isn't straight enough, their nose isn't contoured enough, or their skin isn't light enough, don't love themselves. If we don't love yourself, then that is a reflection of psychological trauma. Finally, Africans, what's important about this Maafa is that African people must retravel this painful past, both psychologically and spiritually, to heal from the trauma of the Maafa. So this just shares that in Haiti, one of the reasons why the Haitian Revolution was so successful was because of the rituals that occurred at Bois-Caïma. The rituals were African spiritual rituals, oftentimes in understanding of knowing of voodoo. African people are encouraged to run away from their culture and traditions. So, what got victory for, one of the things that was instrumental in the victory for African people was the ritual at Bois-Caïma. The Vodun ritual at Bois-Caïma. So as African people, we must understand how we are consciously incarcerated in our mind. Conceptually, we are brainwashed to think and believe that African spiritual tradition is bad. So the picture that I'm going back to just shows that while we think African spirituality is bad, others are practicing our culture and tradition while we're told to run away from it. Find your culture, and we'll meet again discussing the importance and significance of African Black psychology. Thank you.